My name is Claire Whitmore, and if you've ever had to quietly earn your place in your own family, I want you to pull up a chair, pour a warm cup of coffee, and just listen to me for a few minutes. Because today, I'm going to share something with you that I've never said out loud to anyone else. Have you ever let someone take credit for your peace just to keep them happy? Have you ever given your whole heart, your sleepless nights, and your invisible labor to build someone else's grand dream, only to realize they view you as nothing more than a disposable piece of furniture? Type the word boundaries in the comments right now if that hits home for you, because that is exactly where my story begins. It was a Saturday night in mid-October, the kind of crisp, sharp Tennessee evening where the wealthy elite of Nashville dress up to look important. My husband, Julian, was the guest of honor at the annual Mercy Health Charity Gala. He was the CEO and public face of Whitmore Medical Infrastructure, a rapidly scaling firm that supplied specialized surgical equipment and logistics to hospital clinics across 3 states. To the people in that room, Julian was a visionary. He had that smooth, effortless American confidence that men wear like a tailored tuxedo. He remembered everyone's name, bought expensive rounds of top-shelf bourbon, and could charm a nervous hospital administrator into a 5-year contract before the cocktail ice even had time to melt. I was standing right beside him, wearing a dark green velvet dress I had bought on sale, smiling until my cheeks ached, playing the role of the supportive corporate wife. But behind the scenes, away from the glittering chandeliers, the reality was entirely different. An hour into the event, one of our primary institutional investors, a notoriously meticulous man named Marcus Vance, approached Julian with a sharp question about a missing regulatory compliance certification for the upcoming multi-million-dollar funding round. Julian's charming smile stiffened. I watched the subtle twitch in his jaw, the telltale sign that he was entirely out of his depth. He didn't know the answer because he had never bothered to look at the paperwork. Panicking under the investor's gaze, Julian turned to me, his eyes narrowing. But he didn't ask for my help as his partner. He wanted an scapegoat to protect his massive ego. In front of Marcus Vance, 2 prominent board members, and their spouses, Julian snapped his fingers at me, his voice carrying over the music. "Claire, stop standing around looking pretty and go find the compliance binders in the production coordinator's vehicle. Know your place and act like an assistant instead of a guest. Do your job." The entire circle went dead silent. The air left the room. For a second, nobody moved. Julian stared at me with an icy, calculating dominance, expecting me to blush, apologize, and scurry away to fix his mistake like I had done 1,000 times before. But in that exact microsecond, something inside my soul went perfectly, beautifully still. The years of quiet humiliation, the midnight spreadsheets, and the absolute erasure of my existence cracked wide open. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a public scene. Instead, I looked Julian dead in the eye with a calm strength he had never seen in his entire life. I reached up, slowly unclipped my VIP backstage security pass, and laid it flat on the high-top table. Then, with a steady hand, I slipped off my diamond wedding ring and placed it right next to the pass. I turned around and walked out of the ballroom, through the grand glass doors, and straight into the pouring rain without looking back a single time. To truly understand how a woman arrives at a moment where she can walk out on her entire life in a single breath, you have to look at the slow, quiet architecture of how that life was built in the first place. If you've ever found yourself slowly shrinking your own voice just to give someone else more room to breathe, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. Julian didn't become a ruthless corporate giant overnight, and I didn't become an invisible ghost by accident. We built that reality together, brick by brick, over 10 long years of a marriage that felt less like a partnership and more like a beautifully disguised transaction. When I first met Julian, he didn't have a tailored tuxedo or a reserved table at a city gala. He was 28 years old, overflowing with a raw, intoxicating ambition, and running a struggling medical distribution business out of a cramped, poorly insulated rented warehouse on the outskirts of Nashville. He had 2 rusty delivery vans, 3 part-time employees who frequently threatened to quit, and a mountain of disorganized invoices stuffed into faded cardboard boxes beneath his desk. Julian was brilliant at the outward-facing elements of business. He possessed an undeniable charisma, the kind of magnetic charm that could convince a hospital supply manager to take a chance on an unknown distributor. He was the engine of the company, but he completely lacked a steering wheel. He had no concept of regulatory compliance, no patience for supply chain logistics, and an absolute disdain for the tedious, meticulous administrative tracking required to keep a medical company legally alive. I fell in love with his fire, and because I loved him, I quietly stepped into the shadows to become his steering wheel. At the time, I was working a stable, well-paying job as an operations manager for a regional healthcare network. I understood the medical industry's strict legal frameworks, the complex insurance verification protocols, and the grueling standards of state compliance. Slowly, my weekends disappeared. Then my evenings vanished. It started innocently enough, with Julian sitting at our kitchen table, rubbing his temples in utter exhaustion, sighing. "Claire, honey, I just need your eyes on this vendor contract for a few minutes. I don't understand this legal jargon, and the board needs it signed by Monday." So, I would sit down, pour a fresh cup of coffee, and spend my Saturday night rewriting his liability clauses. 1 week turned into a month, and a month turned into a decade. I eventually left my own career entirely to work full-time at Whitmore Medical Infrastructure. But because we were pouring every single penny of profit back into scaling the enterprise, we made a mutual decision. Julian would draw the official executive salary as the CEO, and I would remain off the official payroll as an owner's spouse, quietly managing the entire corporate infrastructure from a small, windowless office at the back of the building. I became the ghost in the machine. While Julian was out playing the role of the visionary entrepreneur at golf courses, Rotary Club lunches, and high-pressure investor dinners, I was the one doing the actual, grueling labor that prevented the entire empire from collapsing under its own weight. I managed the payroll for what grew to be 75 full-time employees. I personally designed the proprietary database architecture that tracked our inventory across 3 separate state lines. I navigated the labyrinth of annual state licensing renewals, negotiated our massive commercial insurance policies, and handled the high-stress midnight phone calls when a critical surgical shipment was delayed at a state border. Julian called what I did office stuff. He spoke about the administrative back end of the company as if it were a minor automated junk drawer, where small, boring tasks magically took care of themselves. He genuinely believed that the company ran on nothing but his pure, unadulterated genius and his ability to give an inspiring speech to a room full of investors. But anyone who has ever actually run a business knows the truth. The grand visionaries might capture the headlines, but it is the quiet, meticulous managers of detail who keep the walls from collapsing. Have you ever let someone take credit for your piece just to keep them happy? Have you ever shrunk your own achievements just to protect the fragile ego of a man who needed to believe he was the king of the castle? Tell me in the comments if you know that feeling, because for 10 years, that was my entire existence. I normalized my own erasure because I believed that loving someone meant carrying their heavy burdens without ever asking for a thank you. As the company scaled from a local distributor into a multi-million-dollar medical supply empire, Julian's vocabulary underwent a subtle, dangerous mutation. It didn't happen all at once. It sneaked into his language in tiny, daily doses. He no longer spoke about what we built at our kitchen table. In his mind, the narrative had completely rewritten itself. The business had become my company. The beautiful mid-century home we bought in the Nashville suburbs became my house. The wealth accumulating in our private accounts became my money. He began drinking his own corporate marketing, genuinely believing that his face on the cover of a local business magazine meant he was the sole architect of our success. I remember a specific night 4 years ago that perfectly illustrated the terrifying depth of his blind spot. We were facing a sudden, unannounced federal audit that threatened to freeze our entire distribution network over a series of clerical filing errors Julian had made while rushing a shipment through compliance. While he fell asleep soundly at midnight after a heavy celebratory dinner with his golf buddies, I sat alone in my small office until 3 o'clock in the morning. With lukewarm, bitter coffee fueling my brain, I manually cross-referenced and corrected over 200 faulty compliance entries, quietly absorbing his mess before the federal inspectors walked through the front door at dawn. When the audit passed with flying colors the next morning, Julian stood in front of the entire staff, pumped his fist in the air, and declared, "My operational instinct is what saved this round, team." I just sat at my desk, matching his public smile, swallowing my own exhaustion. "Don't stress the details, Claire." Julian had scoffed that afternoon when I tried to show him the compliance gaps. "Anyone can organize a computer folder. It's the grand vision that matters in this industry. Focus on the paperwork and let me handle the real business." That memory stayed with me because it was the day I realized my husband didn't just undervalue my work. He fundamentally didn't believe it existed. To him, the infrastructure was like the plumbing in a luxury hotel. You only notice it when it breaks, and as long as it works, you assume it takes care of itself. He had spent years mistaking my quiet efficiency for passivity, assuming that because I didn't demand the microphone, I had nothing of value to say. The internal toll of that dynamic is a heavy, isolating thing to carry. You begin to feel like a ghost in your own home, a highly competent shadow walking through rooms decorated by your own hard work, listening to a man brag about a life you are actively holding up on your tired shoulders. Have you ever looked at the person sleeping next to you and realized they are entirely blind to the actual cost of their comfort? Have you ever sat in a room full of people praising your partner, knowing that if you stopped working for just 48 hours, their entire world would shatter into a million pieces? Share your experiences in the comments, because navigating that psychological isolation is the hardest thing a woman can do. I stayed because I kept telling myself that the success of the business was the ultimate goal, that my marriage was worth the silent sacrifice, and that eventually Julian would see me. But the truth is, a man who closes his eyes to your value will never open them just because you work harder. He will only open them when the foundation you've been providing is completely gone. When I walked out of that gala into the cold autumn rain, I didn't go back to our house. I knew exactly what Julian's playbook would be. He would expect me to be sitting on the edge of our bed, crying, waiting for him to come home so he could deliver a grand corporate lecture on emotional maturity and public decorum. He was a man who viewed every human interaction as a negotiation to be won, an exercise in wearing the other person down until they accepted his terms. I checked into a small, secluded bed and breakfast 30 miles outside of Nashville. It was a quiet place with faded floral wallpaper and a view of a misty valley. The first thing I did when I locked the door behind me was turn my primary phone completely off. I took a deep, shaky breath, dropped it into the bottom of my purse, and chose to exist in total silence. For the first time in 10 years, I wasn't waiting for a crisis to solve. By noon the next morning, Julian's irritation had reached its boiling point. Because my phone was off, an email arrived on my laptop. It wasn't an apology. There was no panic in his words, just a highly polished, condescending corporate memo disguised as a husband's text. "Claire, your dramatic stunt last night was incredibly embarrassing to both me and the board. Marcus Vance noticed your absence, and I had to tell him you were under the weather. Stop being overly sensitive and come home immediately. The international investor group from Zurich arrives in 48 hours for final infrastructure review, and you need to ensure the presentation materials and compliance files are prepared. Let's move past this. I stared at the screen, a cold smile touching my lips. He truly believed my departure was a minor employee strike, a temporary emotional tantrum he could resolve with a firm, managerial directive. He didn't realize that when a quiet person finally leaves, they don't leave room for negotiations. When I didn't reply by Sunday evening, Julian shifted to the next phase of his classic strategy: economic and legal intimidation. He didn't call me himself. Instead, he had his corporate attorney, a ruthless man named Richard Sterling, send a formal letter to my personal email. The letter was sharp and filled with heavy legal jargon, claiming that my sudden disappearance constituted an abandonment of critical operational duties that threatened the financial stability of Whitmore medical infrastructure. To ensure my cooperation, the letter coolly informed me that Julian had temporarily frozen my access to our joint household accounts and corporate expense cards until a formal internal resolution could be reached. It was a brilliant, calculating move designed to starve me out. Julian knew I didn't draw an official corporate salary, and he assumed that without his money, I wouldn't last 72 hours in the real world. He wanted me panicked, isolated, and desperate enough to come crawling back to his office on his terms. But what Julian fundamentally failed to understand is that you cannot scare a woman who has already spent a decade surviving on nothing but her own resilience. He thought he was cutting off my oxygen, but the truth was, he was simply cutting the final cord that tied my dignity to his collapsing world. Have you ever had someone try to use your financial security as a weapon to keep you compliant? Have you ever watched a partner turn entirely cold and transactional the moment you stopped doing what they wanted? Tell me in the comments, because watching the person who is supposed to protect you turn into your primary corporate oppressor is a terrifying awakening. But it is also the exact moment you realize just how dangerous you are about to become. I chose to fight his aggression with absolute, unyielding silence. I didn't reply to Richard Sterling's threatening legal letter, and I didn't acknowledge the notifications showing that my corporate credit cards had been deactivated. I simply sat on the porch of the bed and breakfast, drinking hot tea, and watched the first dominoes tumble from a distance. Back at the headquarters of Whitmore Medical Infrastructure, the subtle, invisible cracks in the foundation were rapidly widening into catastrophic chasms. Julian arrived at the office on Monday morning in his finest tailored suit, ready to command the room and prepare for the massive Zurich investment review. But within 90 minutes, his carefully constructed illusion of control began to disintegrate. He couldn't find the proprietary supply chain logistics folders for the European shipping lanes. He opened the main server, only to realize he didn't possess the administrative encryption keys required to access our primary hospital client database. He stormed into the IT department, demanding they bypass the security protocols, only to be told that the entire network infrastructure had been custom-built and encrypted by me years ago to protect our client records from outside data breaches. "Your filing systems are entirely too complicated, Claire," Julian had scoffed at me 2 years ago during a routine server upgrade. "Anyone can organize a computer folder. It's the high-level corporate vision that matters. Focus on the paperwork and stop making it look like rocket science." Now, that very paperwork was a locked vault, and he was standing outside the gates without a key. By Monday afternoon, the panic had spread far beyond Julian's executive office. Phone calls began flooding into the reception desk from our largest regional hospital accounts. The procurement directors weren't looking for Julian. They were looking for me. They were looking for the quiet woman who always answered their midnight logistics emergencies, manually tracked their custom compliance exemptions, and ensured their operating rooms never ran out of critical surgical components. When our payroll coordinator, Melissa, tried to process the bi-weekly checks for our 75 full-time employees, she hit a hard administrative wall. The specialized compliance software required an updated corporate tax certification that only I knew how to pull from the state portal. Melissa called my personal number, her voice trembling with anxiety. "Claire, I'm so sorry to bother you, but Julian is throwing chairs in his office. He doesn't know the password to the state portal, and the technicians are threatening to walk off the job if their direct deposits are late. What do I do?" I took a slow sip of my tea, feeling a profound sense of calm wash over me. "Melissa," I said gently, "I love you, and I know you're caught in the middle of this. But you need to ask your CEO. He is the one who built this company from the ground up, remember? Let him handle the real business." When I hung up the phone, I didn't feel angry. I felt incredibly free. Julian had spent a decade believing that leadership was at volume. That if you just spoke louder and with enough confidence, the details would magically bow to your will. He was finally discovering a brutal truth that every real worker knows. Confidence cannot replace competence, and a visionary is nothing but a man making empty smiz if he doesn't have an invisible foundation holding up his stage. Have you ever had to step back and let someone completely drop the ball just so they would realize how much you were doing to keep it in the air? Tell me in the comments, because watching an arrogant man realize he is completely helpless without your silent labor is a masterclass in quiet justice. On Tuesday morning, while the internal infrastructure of Julian's company was quietly fracturing under the weight of his own arrogance, I drove back into downtown Nashville. I wasn't going back to the office, and I wasn't going home. I had a scheduled appointment with a woman named Rachel Donovan, a brilliant, sharp-eyed attorney who specialized in a very specific, overlapping intersection of family law and corporate asset protection. I brought nothing with me but a single thick leather briefcase containing 10 years of digital records, private bank statements, and corporate incorporation papers. Rachel sat across from me in her sleek, high-rise office, pouring me a fresh cup of coffee while she quietly reviewed the mountain of documentation I had laid out across her glass conference table. She didn't ask me about the emotional toll of my marriage, and she didn't ask me how I felt when Julian humiliated me at the charity gala. Rachel was a woman who spoke the language of pure, cold logic. She looked at contracts, she tracked the flow of data, and she looked for the invisible lines of ownership that most people completely overlook. After 45 minutes of absolute silence, Rachel slowly pushed her reading glasses up the bridge of her nose, leaned back in her leather chair, and looked at me with a mixture of profound respect and a sharp, calculating smile. "Claire," she said, her voice dropping into a low, steady cadence, "your husband truly believes he has starved you out by freezing your joint personal accounts and your corporate expense cards. He thinks you are completely broke, and he thinks his corporate lawyers hold all the cards." I took a slow sip of my coffee, matching her steady gaze. "And what does the documentation say, Rachel?" She tapped her finger flat against a faded, countersigned incorporation document from 7 years ago. "The documentation says your husband signed his own corporate death warrant because he considered administrative paperwork to be beneath his executive dignity. He was so eager to keep your name off the official corporate payroll of Whitmore Medical Infrastructure, so eager to avoid giving you a public title or a formal seat on his board, that he completely overlooked how you structured the back-end assets." Rachel then proceeded to lay out the massive, game-changing logic twist that would completely alter the trajectory of my entire life. 7 years ago, when the company began scaling rapidly across state lines, we needed to build a highly advanced, custom data architecture to track our specialized medical supply chain logistics and manage our strict hospital client databases. To protect that incredibly valuable data from potential malpractice lawsuits or corporate liability claims against Julian's main corporation, I had quietly made a highly strategic choice. I didn't build that proprietary data infrastructure inside his company. Instead, I had registered a completely separate, independent corporate entity, an operational consulting firm called Vanguard Logistics Systems LLC. I was the 100% sole legal owner, founder, and administrator of Vanguard Logistics Systems LLC. Every line of proprietary code, every custom supply chain database tracking system, every automated compliance verification portal, and every single bit of the encrypted infrastructure that kept Whitmore Medical Infrastructure legally operational didn't belong to Julian's multi-million-dollar empire. It belonged entirely to my private LLC. Julian's corporation had merely been licensing that vital operational brain from my company on a rolling year-to-year contract, a routine intercompany service agreement that Julian had blindly signed at our kitchen table years ago without ever reading it, simply because he considered it boring office paperwork. That contract had officially expired 36 hours ago, on the 1st of the month. I turned directly to the camera, pausing to take a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee as I let the weight of that realization hang in the air for my viewers. Have you ever realized that you held absolutely all the cards right at the exact moment your oppressor thought you were completely broken and defenseless? Type the word boundaries in the comments right now if you are starting to see the incredible, quiet power of a woman who knows how to plan her moves in complete silence. Julian thought he was cutting off my air supply, but the reality was far more beautiful. I owned the entire room he was standing in, and I was about to quietly turn off the lights. By Wednesday morning, the quiet crisis at the headquarters of Whitmore Medical Infrastructure had officially escalated into an operational state of emergency. The elite investment delegation from Zurich had arrived in Nashville, dressed in their sleek charcoal suits, carrying their leather portfolios, ready to conduct the final, high-stakes infrastructure review before transferring the multi-million-dollar funding round into Julian's corporate accounts. But there was no infrastructure to review. The primary server was locked tight behind administrative encryption keys that no one in the building possessed. The hospital client tracking database was completely inaccessible, and the automated state compliance portals were throwing up dark red error messages across every screen in the IT department. Panicked, desperate, and backed completely into a corner, Julian did what he always did when his confidence failed him. He called in his aggressive legal team to force a resolution. He sent an urgent, mandatory directive to my attorney, demanding an immediate emergency meeting at their high-end corporate law offices downtown. He genuinely believed that if he got me into a sterile boardroom, surrounded by intimidating men in expensive suits, he could use his loud voice and his legal threats to bully me into handing over the encryption keys and signing away my digital assets. I arrived at the meeting precisely at 10 o'clock, completely calm, wearing a simple, sharp black blazer, accompanied only by Rachel Donovan. Julian was already sitting at the head of the massive mahogany conference table, his face flushed with an unstable mixture of corporate rage and sheer panic. His ruthless attorney, Richard Sterling, sat right beside him, a thick manila folder of legal threats laid out like a weapon between us. Before I could even pull out my chair, Julian leaned across the table, his voice booming with that hollow, performative bravado I had tolerated for a decade. "Claire, enough is enough. This emotional tantrum has officially crossed the line into corporate sabotage. You are actively disrupting an international funding round. Hand over the administrative passwords and the server encryption keys to my legal team right now, or Richard here is going to file a multi-million-dollar lawsuit for tortious interference before the sun goes down today. Know your place, Claire. You are completely out of your depth." Richard Sterling nodded smoothly, sliding a draft of the lawsuit across the polished wood toward me. "She's right, Claire. You have no legal standing to hold this company's operational data hostage. You are an owner's spouse, not a registered executive." I didn't blink. I didn't reach for the lawsuit, and I didn't look at Julian's wild, angry eyes. I simply turned to Rachel, took a calm sip of my water, and let the silence stretch across the room until the corporate lawyers began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Rachel Donovan smiled faintly, slowly opening her leather briefcase. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice dropping into a razor-sharp, professional cadence that immediately cut through the room's false tension. "My client is not holding your company's data hostage. In fact, my client has spent the last 10 years keeping your client's poorly managed infrastructure legally alive. If you had bothered to conduct a proper internal audit of your own client's corporate assets before filing this absurd paperwork, you would have discovered a very interesting reality." With a perfectly steady hand, Rachel took 3 certified copies of our corporate licensing agreements and laid them flat on the table, sliding them directly into the center of the boardroom. The data architecture, the proprietary supply chain logistics tracking systems, the encrypted hospital database portals, and the entire digital operational brain of Whitmore Medical Infrastructure do not belong to your corporation, Rachel stated coolly. They are the 100% exclusive intellectual and corporate property of Vanguard Logistics Systems, LLC, an independent entity entirely owned and administered by Claire Whitmore. Your company's rolling service contract with my client's LLC officially expired 36 hours ago. My client has chosen not to renew that contract due to a hostile and abusive working environment. The room went completely devastatingly quiet. The air left the boardroom in a single collective gasp. Richard Sterling froze, his hand hovering over his manila folder. He snatched up the countersigned registration papers, his eyes darting across the legal clauses, his face rapidly draining of all its color as the brutal reality set in. He leaned over, whispering frantically into Julian's ear, his pen shaking against his notepad. Julian's booming confidence shattered in a microsecond. The look on his face was unforgettable, a terrifying realization dawning in his eyes as his own corporate lawyers paled beside him. He didn't just lose a quiet, compliant wife at a charity gala. He had legally lost the entire infrastructure of his multi-million-dollar empire. Without my LLC's explicit cooperation and proprietary data access, the Zurich investment round was completely dead. His hospital contracts were legally void by Friday, and his magnificent corporate stage was about to collapse directly into the dirt. Julian sat frozen at the head of the mahogany table, staring at the legal documents as if they were written in a dead language. For 10 years, he had operated under the absolute certainty that he was the apex predator in our world, that his confidence was a shield no logic could pierce. Now that shield was dust. He slowly looked over at Richard Sterling, waiting for his high-priced corporate defender to pull a brilliant loophole out of the air. But Sterling simply closed his folder, leaned back, and gave Julian a microscopic shake of his head. The legal reality was airtight. "Julian," Sterling muttered, his voice stripped of its executive polish, "we need a moment alone with Mrs. Whitmore, please." Rachel and the rest of the corporate legal teams quietly packed their laptops and filed out of the room, the heavy glass doors clicking shut behind them. The silence that settled into the empty boardroom was thick, heavy, and suffocating. Julian didn't look at me. He leaned his elbows on the table and covered his face with his hands. For a long, agonizing minute, the only sound in the room was the low hum of the building's ventilation system. Then his shoulders began to shake. For the first time in my entire life, I heard my husband cry. It wasn't a loud, dramatic sob of grief. It was a hollow, desperate weeping. The sound of a man who had spent his entire life building an empire out of thin air, suddenly realizing he was standing on nothing but a cloud. He wasn't crying because he broke my heart. He wasn't crying because he regretted the public humiliation at the charity gala. He was weeping out of the sheer, unadulterated terror of losing his status, his ego, and the multi-million-dollar crown he had stolen from my silence. "Claire," he whispered, his voice cracking violently as he pulled his hands away from his reddened eyes. "Please, you can't do this to me. The Zurich investors, if they walk away, the company's valuation drops by 60%, everything I've built. It'll all dissolve by Friday. I built this place from nothing, Claire. You know how much blood I poured into this. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting calmly on my lap. I looked at his tears, and for the first time in a decade, I didn't feel the overwhelming instinctual urge to rescue him. I didn't search my brain for a solution to his crisis. No, Julian, I said, my voice coming out low, steady, and terrifyingly calm. We built it. The difference is, I never needed a room full of people to clap for me to know my own value. You spent 10 years telling everyone you were the conductor of the orchestra, but you forgot that while you were bowing for the audience, I was the one keeping the instruments in tune. You told me to know my place. Well, this is my place. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, looking at me like I was a stranger. What do you want, Claire? Money? A seat on the board? Just tell me the number to get the encryption keys back online. We can fix this. I don't want a seat on your board, Julian, and I'm not trying to destroy your empire out of malice, I replied, sliding a revised legal agreement toward him. But I am done holding up a world that refuses to see me. You are going to sign a full, equitable corporate restructuring. My independent LLC will lease the data architecture back to your firm, but at an absolute premium that reflects its true market value. Furthermore, you will agree to a clean, uncontested divorce settlement that secures my fair share of the growth we generated together. If you sign, the keys go back online in 10 minutes. If you don't, you can explain to the Zurich delegation why your multi-million-dollar vision doesn't have an operating system. Julian stared at the pen in his hand, his fingers trembling. He had no tactical moves left. The man who believed a house belonged to whoever spoke the loudest inside it was completely silenced by a piece of paper and a woman who refused to shout. He slowly pressed the pen to the page and signed his name, yielding the control he had spent a lifetime weaponizing against me. I walked out of that skyscraper into the bright Nashville sunshine, carrying my briefcase and a profound, lightweight peace that I hadn't felt since I was 24 years old. The settlement was finalized 6 months later. I received an incredibly fair, life-altering equity payout that tied back to my exact role in growing the corporation's infrastructure. Julian kept Whitmore Medical Infrastructure, but it wasn't the invincible empire he had once imagined. To replace my daily operations output, he was forced to hire 3 separate high-salary managers, a realization that would have made him furious if anyone had suggested paying me even half that amount 5 years earlier. His company survived, but it operates on a much humbler, quieter scale, and so does he. I took my payout and did something that finally aligned with my true purpose. I launched Vanguard Operational Consulting, a specialized firm dedicated entirely to helping behind-the-scenes partners, co-founders, and spouses build sustainable business systems that protect their intellectual and emotional labor. I teach them the lesson I had to learn the hard way. If one person is holding everything together through invisible sacrifice, the business isn't strong. It is simply standing on a person no one remembered to thank. My very first client was a brave widow who was running a regional roofing supplier while her 2 grown sons took all the public credit. My second was a brilliant bakery owner who hadn't taken a single weekend off in 12 long years because her partner claimed she just liked staying busy with the paperwork. Watching these women open their eyes, establish clear boundaries, and reclaim their professional and personal authority has been the most deeply therapeutic, healing work of my life. People sometimes ask me, usually late at night over a glass of wine, if I ever got my revenge on Julian for those 10 years of erasure and that final humiliating night at the charity gala. I always smile, take a slow sip of my coffee, and tell them the exact same thing. Yes, I got my revenge. But not the way they think. I didn't burn his life down. I didn't leak his files, leak his database secrets, or trash his corporate reputation to the media. I simply stepped out of the fire with the bucket in my hands. And when I walked away, everything he had built on my silent compliance finally had to bear its own weight. Sometimes, true revenge isn't destruction. Sometimes revenge is simply having the intelligence, the patience, and the courage to let the truth walk into the room after you leave. If this story touched something deep inside your soul today, I want you to take a deep breath and remember this. Never mistake quiet loyalty for weakness, and never take for granted the person who quietly keeps your entire world from falling apart. If you are ready to stop shrinking your voice to keep an unstable house happy, if you are ready to stop holding up a world that refuses to see your worth, I want you to go down to the comments right now and type the word boundaries. Let's start remembering our value together. Share your thoughts below, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us for the next story.